All right, the committee will come to order. Chairman notes the presence of a quorum, and so the Subcommittee on Public Lands and Environmental Regulations is meeting today to hear testimony on threats, intimidation, and bullying by federal land managing agencies. Under the committee rules, opening statements are limited to the chairman and ranking member of the subcommittee. However, I ask unanimous consent to include any other members' opening statements in the hearing record if they are submitted to the clerk by the close of business today. And hearing no objections, that is so ordered. Let me begin, if I could, by saying how happy I am to have the witnesses here who will be speaking to us. Today we're going to hear from about a number of troubling cases in which federal land managing agencies have employed abusive tactics to extort rural families into giving up property rights, or to bully farmers and ranchers into making concessions to which the federal agency had no legal right. It is not an easy thing for someone to stand up to the government. In fact, in most of the world, that is impossible. But America is different, and it should be different. We should not be afraid to take on the federal government when it trespasses on our rights, and the witnesses before us today are doing just that. I'm grateful for their courage. In many respects, the word heroes or great Americans is too overused, but you indeed are. The Supreme Court has called on Congress to fashion a legal remedy, a cause of action, through which the victims of abuse can have the opportunity to seek redress in the courts. This hearing, I hope, is going to be the first step in getting Congress to protect and strengthen civil rights and property rights, our civil rights, of people whose property the government wants to take without compensation. Legal scholars tell us that property rights are actually a bundle, and that bundle includes water rights and grazing rights and mineral rights and access to recreation rights. And with 1/3 of America being owned by the federal government and it being predominantly in the West, it is no coincidence that most of the problems that we have in dealing with those rights in the federal government are situated in states found in the West, the so-called public land states. I realize that there are going to be a lot of people that are going to try to make this into a conservative versus liberal framework, but that is simply not the case. If you read the two justices who put an opinion on one of these cases before us, you'll find it is the so-called justices from the left who are most emphatic about the rights being abused by the federal government. If I could quote Justice Ginsburg from a case that involved Mr. Robbins, who will testify shortly. The BLM officials mounted a 7-year campaign of relentless harassment and intimidation to force Robbins to give in. They refused to maintain the road providing access to the ranch, trespassed on Robbins' property, brought unfounded criminal charges against him, canceled his special recreational use permits and grazing privileges, interfered with his business operations, and invaded the privacy of his ranch guests on cattle drives. She went on to write, "The case presents this question: does the Fifth Amendment provide an effective check on federal officers who abuse their regulatory powers by harassing and punishing property owners who refuse to surrender their property to the United States without fair compensation? The answer should be a resounding yes. Unfortunately, the answer in reality is no, unless we in Congress do something to rectify the situation." I want to also admit that even though this is happening with this particular administration, it is not limited to this administration. These same type of actions done by land managers in the Forest Service, the BLM, Fish and Wildlife, those same actions took place not only today in this administration, but they took place under both the Bush administrations and the Clinton administration and the Reagan administration. Unfortunately, it is a pattern of habit and a pattern of activity that is far too common and must stop in some way. Some will say this is simply a carry-on or a second part to the hearing we had over the barricades being put up during the shutdown. This is more than just barricade part 2. In fact, it is the reverse. Putting up the barricades in the shutdown was an example of the attitude that has always been used, especially in the West, in making public land decisions that have harmed individuals. So that is what we are trying to go for, the longer picture in some way. So with that, Ms. Bud Fallon, welcome back to this committee. It's good to see you again. We're going to start with you, and then we'll work just down the table.
Thank you, Chairman Bishop and members of the committee. Over 200 years ago, America's founding fathers rejected the notion that all power in this nation should come from a king and that the citizens were servants or subjects of the king's rule. Rather, this nation was founded on the principle that each of the three branches of government was to be a check on the other. Under this carefully crafted and carefully compromised system, this body of elected legislators is to represent the citizens who send them to these hollow halls. The executive branch is to implement the laws that you pass, and the individual citizen is protected from the abuse of the majority as well as abuse from other individuals by the courts. The Bill of Rights was not written and adopted to give the federal government power. Rather, the Bill of Rights is a document that guarantees that the inalienable rights of the citizens are protected from the abuse of the federal government's power. But this system, where power is to be based in the people, is broken. And so the checks and balances so carefully and skillfully compromised in the Constitution are broken. What we have now is a system that bars citizens from litigating against federal individual employees in court for abuses of power. And what we've really turned into is that all-powerful, unelected, and unaccountable bureaucracy has set up a dictatorship over some of the private citizens who actually employ them. This bureaucratic power is wielded simply by some bureaucrats who use the power of the federal regulations and the, quote, color of their office, unquote, to take private property and
point during this nearly decades-long harassment campaign against you. Did you ever consider just giving in to the BLM just to make it go away?
I wish I could say yes to that, but I just, you know, what's right's right and what's wrong is wrong.
Yeah.
And if I had to give up everything, I was willing.
Ms. Bud Fallon, back to the legal side. While a majority of the Supreme Court declined to recognize that Mr. Robbins had a claim against the BLM for the entire course of conduct, they did nonetheless recognize the need for an effective remedy for people in Mr. Robinson's situation. Is that correct?
Yes. Both the majority opinion written by Justice Roberts as well as a very strong dissent written by Justice Ginsburg both recognize that Congress should give us a path to the federal court.
I want to apologize to you for what you've been through, and thank you for your tenacity in upholding the constitutional rights of Americans. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you.
Thank you. Allow me to ask a couple of questions. Let me follow up on where Ms. Lummis was originally, Ms. Bud Fallon. If Congress fails in some way to take up the court's challenge to how you find a legislative remedy, is there any way that a poor rancher, which is all ranchers, they're land rich and money poor, or modest means rancher, could they ever survive the kind of assaults we've heard about today?
Mr. Chairman, I honestly do not believe that's possible. I represent ranchers all over the West, and when you go against the federal government represented by the Justice Department that has all of the money and resources in the world, it is very difficult, if not impossible, to be able to win these cases.
All right.
And additionally, because we are not is easily equal access to Justice Act or Judgment Fund monies, we don't even have the chance to get our money back. None of these people have received payment for their work.
For all of you, keep in touch with Ms. Lummis. We'll be talking about Egypt later on as well. Mr. Robbins, let me follow up with the kind of approach that Mr. Amodei was starting with Mr.